The eviction notice arrived on a Tuesday morning, slipped under the door while Sarah Mitchell was getting her daughter ready for school. She found it when she returned from the bus stop, the crisp white paper stark against the worn welcome mat. Her hands trembled as she unfolded it, though she had known it was coming. 3 months behind on rent, 14 days to vacate. The words blurred as she read them, not from tears, but from the exhaustion that had become her constant companion. She set the notice on the kitchen counter, next to the stack of unpaid bills that had grown taller each week. Medical bills from Emma's hospital stay last winter, the car repair she had put on credit, the utilities she had been juggling, paying just enough to keep the lights on for 1 more month. She stared at the numbers, so at the impossible mathematics of survival, and felt the familiar tightening in her chest that had nothing to do with drama and everything to do with the slow, grinding reality of being 1 paycheck away from homelessness. The apartment was small, barely more than a converted attic above a laundromat, but it had been theirs for 3 years. Emma's drawings covered one wall, taped up with careful precision. The second-hand furniture Sarah had refinished herself filled the space with a warmth that money could not buy. She had made this place a home through sheer determination, through nights spent sewing curtains from discount fabric and painting walls with clearance paint. Now, it would all be boxed up and carried away, assuming she could afford boxes. She walked to the window and looked down at the street below. The neighborhood was not the kind featured in magazines or praised in city development plans. It was the kind where people worked 2 jobs and still could not get ahead, where corner stores had bars on the windows and sirens were the soundtrack of sleep. But it had been affordable, or at least it had been before the rent increased twice in 18 months. Now even this threadbare security was slipping through her fingers. Sarah had worked as a bookkeeper for a small manufacturing firm for 7 years, a job that paid just enough to keep her and Emma fed and housed, but never enough to build savings or plan for emergencies. When the firm downsized 6 months ago, she had been let go with 2 weeks of severance and a handshake that felt like an apology for something no one could control. Since then, she had scraped together work where she could find it. Freelance accounting for small businesses, data entry gigs that paid by the spreadsheet, occasional shifts at a grocery store that left her feet aching and her spirit bruised. It was never enough. The gap between what she earned and what she owed widened each month, no matter how carefully she budgeted, no matter how many meals she skipped to make sure Emma had enough. She had sold everything of value long ago. Her grandmother's jewelry, the laptop she had saved for, even the wedding ring from a marriage that had ended before Emma was born. Each sale bought a little more time, but time was a resource that eventually ran out. The notice gave her 14 days. She had maybe $300 in her checking account and another $70 in cash hidden in an envelope marked emergency. It was not enough for a deposit on a new apartment, even in the cheapest neighborhoods. It was not enough for a motel room for more than a few nights. She thought of Emma, 8 years old, and blissfully unaware of how close they were to the edge, and felt a cold dread settle into her bones. That afternoon, after another fruitless job search, Sarah sat in the public library with her laptop connected to the free Wi-Fi. She had learned to spend her days here when the apartment felt too small and the weight of failure too heavy. The library was warm in winter, cool in summer, and no one asked questions if you sat quietly and did not cause trouble. She refreshed her email, or hoping for a response to one of the dozens of applications she had sent out. Nothing. Just spam and automated rejections that thanked her for her interest and wished her well in her future endeavors. She opened a new browser tab and typed the words she had been avoiding for weeks. Emergency housing assistance. The results filled the screen with bureaucratic language and waiting lists that stretched months into the future. She clicked through page after page, reading requirements she did not meet, income thresholds that excluded her because she technically still earned something, addresses of shelters that were already full. Each link felt like another door closing. Then, almost by accident, she found it. A county auction website listing properties seized for unpaid taxes or abandoned by their owners. The listings were sparse, most of them vacant lots or condemned buildings that would cost more to repair than they were worth. She scrolled out of idle curiosity, not expecting anything, when a single entry caught her eye. Former industrial property, approximately 47,000 square feet, sold as is. Minimum bid, $1. The address was familiar. She had driven past the old Kellerman factory dozens of times on her way to Emma's school. It sat on the eastern edge of the city, a hulking ruin of brick and broken windows that everyone knew and no one thought about. The factory had been abandoned for nearly 2 decades, its roof partially collapsed, its walls covered in graffiti, its grounds overgrown with weeds that pushed through cracked asphalt. It was not a property. It was a problem, a liability waiting for someone foolish enough to claim it. Sarah stared at the listing. $1 for 47,000 square feet of land and structure. The rational part of her mind immediately cataloged the reasons this was insane. The building was condemned. It would cost hundreds of thousands to demolish or restore. The property taxes alone, once ownership transferred, would be more than she could afford. It was a trap, a bureaucratic snare designed to offload municipal headaches onto desperate people. But another part of her, the part that had kept her moving forward when everything told her to give up, saw something else. She saw space. She saw possibility. She saw a foothold in a world that had offered her nothing but closed doors. Even if the building was worthless, the land beneath it was real. And real land, no matter how damaged, was more than she had now. She clicked on the auction details. The bidding opened in 3 days and closed 48 hours later. Interested parties were required to submit bids electronically, along with proof of ability to pay. $1. She could manage $1. She could not manage rent, could not manage deposits, could not manage the endless cascade of expenses that crushed her every month. But she could manage a single dollar. The idea took root slowly, almost against her will. What if she bid? What if, by some miracle, no one else wanted this crumbling ruin? What if she could own something, even something broken, instead of renting a space that could be taken away with 14 days' notice? She knew it was irrational. She knew the sensible thing was to focus on finding stable work, on securing housing Emma could depend on. But sensible had not saved her yet. Sensible had left her with an eviction notice and $300. That night, after Emma was asleep, Sarah sat at the kitchen table with a notebook and began to calculate. If she won the auction, ownership would transfer within 30 days. Property taxes would be assessed based on the land value, which, given the condition and location, might be negligible for the first year. The building was unusable, but the lot was large enough that she could potentially live in a trailer or small structure on the property while figuring out the next steps. It was not a plan. It was barely a hope. But it was more than she had when she woke up that morning. She researched the factory's history, pulling up old newspaper articles and city records. Kellerman Manufacturing had operated from the 1950s through the early 2000s, producing industrial components and machine parts. At its peak, it employed over 200 workers and supplied factories across the Midwest. Then globalization and changing markets had eroded its customer base. The company downsized, then closed, then dissolved entirely. The property had changed hands twice through bankruptcy proceedings before finally being seized by the county for unpaid taxes. No one had wanted it. Not developers, not investors, not even scrappers who might have salvaged copper or steel. It sat there for 18 years, slowly collapsing under the weight of neglect and weather. The surrounding neighborhood had declined with it, property values dropping, businesses closing, residents moving away. The Kellerman factory had become a symbol of abandonment, a place people pointed to when they talked about the city's slow decay. Sarah looked at the photos included in the auction listing. The exterior walls, though stained and crumbling in places, still stood. The main structure, a massive rectangular building with high ceilings, had been designed to house heavy machinery. The windows were shattered or missing entirely, and portions of the roof had caved in, exposing rusted beams and waterlogged insulation. The grounds were a wasteland of broken pavement, rusting equipment, and vegetation that had reclaimed every unguarded inch. It was, by any reasonable measure, a disaster. And yet, Sarah found herself staring at those images long after she should have closed the laptop and gone to bed. She imagined walking through those cavernous rooms, imagined what it would feel like to own something solid and unmovable, even if it was broken, even if it was hopeless. The auction opened on Friday morning. Sarah logged in from the library, her heart pounding as the countdown timer ticked toward 0. She had submitted her bid the night before. $1, the minimum. She had included the required proof of funds, a screenshot of her checking account showing she could, in fact, afford a single dollar. Now, all she could do was wait. The first day passed with no other bids. Sarah refreshed the page every hour, certain that someone would appear at the last moment, someone with actual plans and actual resources. But the listing remained unchanged. By Saturday morning, she allowed herself to believe, just slightly, that this absurd gamble might actually work. Then, at 10:32 a.m., a second bid appeared. $2. Sarah's stomach dropped. Of course someone else would see what she had seen, or at least see an opportunity to flip the property for scrap or rezoning. She stared at the screen, frozen with indecision. She could bid again. $3. $4. But every dollar mattered when you had so few. And what was the point? Whoever this other bidder was, they clearly had more room to maneuver than she did. She closed the laptop and walked out of the library, her chest tight with frustration and disappointment. She had been foolish to hope. The world did not offer miracles to people like her. It offered eviction notices and empty job listings, and the slow, grinding certainty that no matter how hard you worked, it would never be enough. But as she walked home through the cold October afternoon, something shifted inside her. Anger, maybe, or stubbornness. She thought of Emma, thought of the eviction notice, thought of the endless cycle of barely surviving. She thought of the factory, sitting empty and unwanted for 18 years, and decided that if she was going to lose, she would at least make someone else pay more than $2 for it. She returned to the library and submitted a new bid. $5. It was reckless. It was stupid. But it was hers to spend, and she would rather spend it on a chance, no matter how slim, than watch it disappear into the void of late fees and interest charges. The counterbidder raised to $10. Sarah raised to $15. The anonymous opponent went to $25. Sarah hesitated, her finger hovering over the keyboard. And $25 was groceries. It was gas. It was the difference between making it through the week and not. But it was also less than the cost of a single night in the cheapest motel she could find. She bid $30. The auction closed at noon on Sunday. Sarah sat in the library, her laptop open, her hands clenched together so tightly her knuckles ached. The final minutes ticked down. No new bids appeared. At 12 p.m. exactly, the listing updated. Sold. Winning bid, $30. Sarah stared at the screen, unable to process what she was seeing. She had won. She owned the Kellerman factory. 47,000 square feet of broken brick and shattered glass and buried possibility. She had spent $30 and gained a title to a property no one else had wanted. The notification email arrived moments later, outlining the next steps, and payment was due within 5 business days. Transfer of title would occur within 30 days of payment. Property taxes would be assessed upon transfer of ownership. She sat back in the chair, her mind spinning. She had done something irrevocable. She had tied herself to a piece of land that could easily become an anchor dragging her under. But she had also, for the first time in as long as she could remember, taken a step forward instead of just holding her ground. When she told Emma that night, she framed it as an adventure. They were going to move to a new place, she said. Somewhere with lots of room to explore. Emma, who had been promised moves before that never materialized, nodded with the cautious optimism of a child who had learned not to count on things. Sarah kissed her forehead and promised that this time would be different. She did not tell anyone else, not her mother, who would have called her insane, not the few friends she still kept in touch with, who were struggling just as hard and would not understand. She carried the knowledge alone, a secret weight that felt both terrifying and strangely liberating. The eviction deadline arrived. Sarah packed their belongings into boxes she scavenged from behind the grocery store. She loaded everything into her aging sedan, the suspension groaning under the weight. On the last day, she stood in the empty apartment and felt nothing. No sadness, no nostalgia, just the quiet certainty that she was leaving behind a place that had never truly been home. She drove across the city with Emma in the passenger seat, pointing out landmarks and making up stories to keep her daughter distracted. When they turned onto the industrial road that led to the factory, Emma pressed her face against the window, her eyes widening. "Is that it?" she asked. Sarah looked at the building looming ahead. Even in daylight, it looked ominous, its dark windows like hollow eyes, its walls stained with years of rain and pollution. The chain-link fence surrounding the property sagged in places, held up more by rust than structural integrity. The sign that once announced Kellerman Manufacturing hung at an angle, barely legible beneath layers of grime and graffiti. "That's it," Sarah said quietly. "It's big," Emma said, and there was wonder in her voice that Sarah had not expected. "It is," Sarah agreed. "It's ours." She pulled through the open gate, the car crunching over broken glass and gravel. She parked near the main entrance, a set of heavy steel doors that had been pried open long ago and never closed. The air smelled of rust and damp earth and decay. Sarah turned off the engine and sat for a moment, staring at the building that she now, inexplicably, owned. This was insane. This was a mistake. This was the worst decision she had ever made. But it was also the only decision that felt like hers. For $30 and a desperate hope, she had bought herself space to breathe, to think, to figure out what came next. The factory might be worthless. It might bury her under debt and responsibility. But it was real, and it was hers, and no landlord could take it away with 14 days' notice. Sarah stepped out of the car and looked up at the building. The October wind moved through the shattered windows, so creating a low whistle that sounded almost like a greeting. She pulled her jacket tighter and walked toward the entrance, Emma following close behind. The interior was darker than she expected. Sunlight filtered through holes in the roof, casting uneven beams across the vast open floor. The space was cavernous, the ceiling at least 30 feet high, supported by massive steel beams that had rusted, but still held. The floor was concrete, cracked and stained, littered with debris, broken glass, old equipment, scraps of metal. The walls bore the scars of decades, peeling paint, water damage, graffiti layered over graffiti. But beneath the decay, Sarah could see the bones of what the factory had been. The solid construction, the thoughtful layout, the sheer scale of the space. This had been built to last, designed by people who believed in permanence. And despite 18 years of abandonment, it was still standing. She walked slowly through the main floor, her footsteps echoing in the emptiness. Emma stayed close, clutching her mother's hand, her eyes wide as she took in the strange new world they had entered. Sarah pointed out the old loading bays along one wall, the office area partitioned off by glass walls, now mostly shattered. She noticed the industrial lighting fixtures still hanging from the ceiling, corroded but intact. They climbed a metal staircase to the second level, testing each step carefully. Up here, the damage was worse. The roof had collapsed in several places, leaving gaping holes that exposed the sky. Rain had pooled on the floor, creating dark stains and encouraging the growth of mold that spread like shadows. But there were also sections that remained relatively dry, protected by overhanging beams or intact portions of roofing. Sarah stood near one of the empty window frames and looked out across the property. The factory sat on nearly 2 acres of land, most of it paved or overgrown. In the distance, she could see the remnants of a smaller outbuilding, maybe a storage shed or garage. Beyond the fence, the neighborhood stretched out, a patchwork of aging row houses and vacant lots. "Can we really live here?" Emma asked, her voice small. Sarah knelt down beside her daughter and looked her in the eye. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "But we're going to try." That first night, they slept in the car, parked inside the factory floor for safety. Sarah had brought blankets and pillows, and they made a nest in the back seat. The building creaked and settled around them, strange sounds echoing through the vast space. Emma fell asleep quickly, exhausted from the day. Sarah lay awake, staring at the darkness beyond the windshield, wondering what she had done. In the morning, she began to explore more systematically. She walked the perimeter of the building, noting structural damage, areas of concern, potential hazards. She cataloged what was salvageable and what was beyond hope. The task was overwhelming, but she approached it the same way she had approached every impossible situation in her life, one step at a time, one decision at a time. The neighbors noticed within days. Cars slowed as they passed, drivers craning their necks to see who had moved into the abandoned factory. A few people stopped and called out questions. Sarah answered politely but vaguely. She was fixing the place up, she said, making it livable. The responses ranged from skeptical laughter to outright disbelief. "You bought this place?" one man asked, his tone equal parts amused and pitying. "Lady, this building should have been torn down 10 years ago." "Maybe," Sarah said, "but it's mine now." The word spread quickly through the neighborhood. The crazy woman who bought the Kellerman factory for next to nothing and thought she could make something of it. Sarah felt the weight of their judgment, their certainty that she was wasting her time and money on a lost cause. She heard the whispers at the corner store, saw the looks when she drove past with Emma in the car. People thought she was desperate, delusional, or both. They were not entirely wrong. She was desperate. But desperation had a way of sharpening focus, of stripping away the luxury of caution. She could not afford to care what they thought. She could only afford to keep moving forward. She began to make the space habitable in the smallest possible ways. She cleared one section of the main floor, sweeping away debris, scrubbing the concrete, boarding up broken windows. She set up a camping stove for cooking and brought in water jugs from the store. She hung tarps to create makeshift walls, giving them privacy and some protection from the drafts that swept through the building. It was rough, uncomfortable, and nothing like a real home. But it was shelter, and it was theirs. Emma adapted with the resilience of childhood. She turned the factory into an adventure, exploring every corner, making friends with the pigeons that nested in the rafters, for inventing games that filled the vast empty spaces with laughter. Sarah watched her daughter and felt a complicated mixture of guilt and relief. This was no life for a child, but it was better than a shelter, better than sleeping in the car, better than the constant fear of where they would go next. Weeks passed. Sarah found odd jobs when she could, working from a laptop she charged at the library, taking on freelance accounting work that paid little but kept them fed. She learned to navigate the city's bureaucracy, filling out forms for utility hookups, applying for permits she could not afford, documenting everything in case she ever needed to prove that she was trying to make this work. The factory revealed itself slowly, like a puzzle with pieces scattered across 2 decades. She found old machinery in the back rooms, a rusted but still impressive in its complexity. She discovered an office on the 3rd floor, papers still scattered across desks, as if everyone had simply walked away mid-shift. She uncovered storage areas filled with pallets and empty crates, remnants of a business that had once thrived. And then, on a gray afternoon in early November, she found the first anomaly. She was exploring the basement level, a space she had avoided until now because of the standing water and the smell of mold. But she needed to understand the building's foundation, to assess whether the damage was purely superficial or structural. She descended the concrete stairs carefully, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. The basement was a labyrinth of corridors and storage rooms, many of them flooded with several inches of dark water. She waded through carefully, documenting the damage, when she noticed something odd. One section of the wall, near the far corner of the basement, looked different from the others. The concrete was cleaner, less stained by water and time. She approached it, running her hand across the surface, and felt the edge of something unusual. A seam, a door, maybe, or a panel that had been sealed over. She pressed against it, testing the resistance, and felt it give slightly. Her heart quickened. She grabbed a pry bar from her toolkit and wedged it into the seam, applying steady pressure. The concrete facing cracked and fell away in chunks, revealing not another wall, but the edge of a heavy steel door set flush into the foundation. Sarah stepped back, her pulse racing. The door was industrial, the kind designed for security rather than convenience. It had no visible handle or lock on this side, only a flush surface that suggested it opened inward. She examined it closely, noting the lack of corrosion, the pristine condition compared to everything else in the basement. This was not original to the building. This had been installed later, deliberately, and then concealed. She tried to pry the door open, but it did not budge. Whatever mechanism held it closed was beyond the reach of her tools. She stood there in the dim basement, water soaking through her shoes, staring at the hidden door and wondering what lay beyond it. The discovery both excited and unsettled her. Someone had gone to great lengths to hide this. Someone had wanted whatever was behind that door to remain undiscovered. As she climbed back up the stairs, her mind raced with possibilities. A storage vault for valuable equipment, a safe room for company records, or something else entirely, something valuable enough to seal away from the world. She knew she would not rest until she found a way to open it. But for now, all she could do was add it to the growing list of mysteries the factory held. That evening, as she and Emma ate a simple dinner of canned soup heated on the camping stove, Sarah looked around at the makeshift home they had created. The factory was still a ruin, still impossible, still a gamble that everyone believed would fail. But it was also becoming something else, a shelter, a challenge, a strange kind of hope. She did not tell Emma about the hidden door. Not yet. But as she lay awake that night, listening to the wind move through the broken windows, when she thought about that sealed steel surface and wondered what secrets the Kellerman factory had kept for all these years, and whether those secrets might, against all odds, hold the answers she so desperately needed. The hidden door haunted Sarah's thoughts in the days that followed. She returned to the basement repeatedly, each time with different tools, different approaches, trying to find a way through the steel barrier. She tried prying at the edges, searching for hinges or weak points, tapping the surface to gauge its thickness. Nothing worked. The door remained sealed, immovable, a question mark embedded in concrete. She researched the factory's history more thoroughly, spending hours at the county records office and the library's local history section. She learned that Kellerman Manufacturing had been more than just a parts supplier. In its later years, before the decline, the company had contracted with several government agencies, producing specialized components for defense and aerospace applications. The contracts were vague in their descriptions, protected by layers of bureaucratic language that revealed nothing specific. One document caught her attention: a building modification permit filed in 1987, requesting approval for secure storage installation, basement level. The permit had been approved with minimal review, stamped and filed away. No details about what was being stored or why. Just the acknowledgement that something had been added to the building's infrastructure, something that required security. And Sarah photographed the document and added it to the growing folder of evidence she was assembling. The factory was not just an abandoned industrial space. It had secrets, and she was standing on top of them. The question was whether those secrets would save her or bury her deeper. The financial pressure continued to mount. The property taxes she had hoped would be negligible arrived in a bill that made her stomach drop. $1,800, due within 60 days. The assessment was based on the land value, not the ruined building, but it was still far more than she had budgeted for. She stared at the notice, feeling the familiar weight of impossible mathematics pressing down on her. She picked up more work, taking on projects that paid too little for the hours required. She skipped meals more often, and telling Emma they were having light dinner nights, when in truth, there was barely anything in their makeshift pantry. She washed their clothes in buckets, hung them to dry on ropes strung between steel beams. She learned to stretch every dollar until it screamed. The neighbors watched with a mixture of pity and schadenfreude. She heard the comments when she went to the corner store for supplies. "Still living in that death trap?" one woman asked, not bothering to lower her voice. "You should have taken whatever money you had left and gotten a decent apartment." Sarah did not respond. She paid for her groceries and left, her jaw tight. What they didn't understand, what they could never understand, was that there was no decent apartment within reach. There was no safety net, no family to fall back on, no savings to cushion the fall. And there was only this, the factory and the gamble she had made, and she would see it through no matter what they thought. Emma's teacher called, expressing concern. The girl was doing well academically, but she had become withdrawn, quiet during group activities. She had told classmates she lived in a factory, and they had laughed, thinking she was making up stories. The teacher wanted to schedule a home visit to see Emma's living situation and ensure it was appropriate. Sarah felt panic grip her chest. A home visit would reveal everything: the camping stove, the tarps hung as walls, the complete absence of proper facilities. Child Protective Services would be called. Emma would be taken away. The thought terrified her more than anything else. She promised the teacher she would arrange something, then hung up and sat in the cold factory, her head in her hands, trying to figure out how to make a ruin look like a home. That night, she lay awake on the thin sleeping bag that served as her bed, listening to Emma's quiet breathing beside her. The building settled around them, creaking and shifting, alive with the sounds of decay. She thought about giving up, about walking away from the factory, from the crushing weight of responsibility, from the impossible dream of making something from nothing. But then she thought about the door in the basement, about the secret someone had worked so hard to hide, about the fact that this building for all its flaws, was still standing after 18 years of abandonment. Something about it was built to last. Something about it mattered. In the morning, she made a decision. She would focus on the door. If there was any chance, any possibility that what lay behind it could help them, she had to pursue it. Everything else could wait. She brought in a locksmith, a grizzled man named Ray, who had agreed to come out for cash under the table. He descended into the basement with her, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, and examined the steel door with professional detachment. "This is military grade," he said, running his fingers along the seam. "Probably installed during the Cold War era. You see this kind of thing in old government facilities. Secure storage, bunkers, that sort of thing." "Can you open it?" Sarah asked. Ray was quiet for a long moment, studying the door from multiple angles. "Maybe," he said finally. "But not with picks. This kind of lock, if it even has a traditional lock mechanism, would require specialized tools I don't have. Your better bet would be cutting through. But you're talking about serious equipment. Plasma cutter, maybe. That's expensive work." "How expensive?" "A few thousand, minimum. And that's assuming the door isn't reinforced with something that would make cutting impractical. Could be more." Sarah felt the hope drain out of her. A few $1,000s might as well have been a few million. She thanked Ray, paid him the $50 they had agreed on, and watched him leave. She stood alone in the basement, staring at the door, feeling the weight of its resistance. But she didn't give up. She spent the next week researching alternatives, watching YouTube videos about lock mechanisms, reading forums where people discussed breaking into old safes and vaults. She learned about weak points, about leverage, about the physics of sealed containers. None of it seemed applicable to her situation, but she absorbed the information anyway, hoping something would click. Then she found a video about emergency override systems. Some secure facilities, particularly those built during certain decades, included manual override mechanisms in case of power failure or lock malfunction. The overrides were typically hidden, designed to be accessible only to authorized personnel who knew where to look. Sarah returned to the basement with renewed purpose. She examined every inch of the wall surrounding the door, searching for anomalies, panels, anything that might conceal a secondary access point. She tapped the concrete, listening for hollow spaces. She scraped away layers of grime and mold, looking for markings or indicators. Hours passed. Her back ached from crouching. Her fingers were raw from scraping concrete. Emma called down from upstairs, asking if she was okay. Sarah assured her she was fine, just working on a project, and returned to her search. It was nearly dark when she found it. A small metal plate, barely larger than her palm, set into the concrete about 6 feet to the left of the door and roughly 4 feet above the floor. She had almost missed it, covered as it was by decades of accumulated grime. She cleaned it carefully, revealing a series of faint markings etched into the surface. Numbers. A sequence. Her heart began to race. She tried to pry the plate open, but it was sealed tight. She examined the edges, noting the precision of the fit, the way it sat flush against the concrete. This was intentional, and this was designed to be found by someone who knew to look for it. She spent another hour trying to manipulate the plate, pressing different combinations of the numbers, searching for a release mechanism. Nothing happened. Frustration mounted, but she forced herself to think logically. If this was an emergency override, it would need to be simple enough to use in a crisis, but secure enough to prevent accidental activation. She looked at the numbers again. They were not random. They formed a pattern, a sequence that suggested a combination or code. She tried entering them in order, pressing each number with her fingertip. On the third attempt, she felt something give. A faint click echoed in the basement. The metal plate popped open, revealing a recessed panel behind it. Inside was a manual crank, T-shaped and made of heavy steel, and Sarah stared at it for a moment, hardly daring to believe what she was seeing. She gripped the crank and began to turn. The resistance was immediate and fierce. The mechanism had not been used in decades, and rust had welded components together. But slowly, with effort that made her shoulders burn, the crank began to move. She heard grinding metal, the protest of gears forced back into motion. And then, with a deep metallic groan that echoed through the basement, the steel door shifted. It moved inward, just an inch at first, breaking the seal that had held it closed for so long. Sarah stopped cranking and pulled at the door's edge. It swung open on hinges that screamed in protest, revealing darkness beyond. She stood at the threshold, her flashlight beam cutting into the void, her heart pounding. The air that rushed out was stale, and cold, and faintly metallic. She stepped inside carefully, testing the floor before committing her weight. The space beyond was smaller than she expected, roughly 15 feet by 20, with walls lined in what appeared to be steel panels. And against those walls, stacked with military precision, were rows upon rows of metal cases. Sarah approached the nearest stack, her hands trembling. The cases were heavy, sealed with latches that showed minimal corrosion despite the years. She opened one, the latches snapping free with sharp clicks, and lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in custom-fitted foam, were objects she did not immediately recognize. Small, cylindrical, made of brass, and sealed in protective plastic. She lifted one out, turning it in the light. They were shell casings, she realized, but not ordinary ones. These were marked with specifications, lot numbers, manufacturer stamps, military surplus, perhaps, or industrial components from Kellerman's government contracts. She set it down carefully and moved to another case. This one held different items, small machined parts, precision instruments, all carefully preserved and cataloged. She spent over an hour opening cases, documenting what she found. Most contained industrial components, specialized parts that might have value to collectors or researchers, but nothing that suggested immediate wealth. She began to feel the familiar descent into disappointment. This was a storage vault, nothing more. Valuable, perhaps, but not life-changing. Then she opened a case near the back of the room, and everything changed. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth and sealed in plastic, were documents. She lifted them out carefully, unwrapping the layers with shaking hands. The first bundle contained blueprints, technical drawings of machinery, and systems she could not fully understand. But beneath those were different papers. Certificates. Stock certificates, to be precise, issued by Kellerman Manufacturing to various holders in the 1970s and 1980s. Sarah's breath caught. She flipped through them, counting. There were hundreds of certificates, representing thousands of shares. But the company had dissolved decades ago. These would be worthless now, relics of a business that no longer existed. She set them aside and reached deeper into the case. Her fingers touched something else. A smaller bundle, wrapped separately, sealed with wax that had cracked but still held. She broke the seal and unfolded the papers inside. These were different, newer. Transfer documents dated just months before the factory closed, showing the conversion of Kellerman Manufacturing's assets into holdings in other companies. Diversification in anticipation of bankruptcy. And attached to these documents were new certificates, shares in companies she recognized, companies that still existed, companies that had grown significantly since the 1990s. Her hands began to shake so badly she nearly dropped the papers. She forced herself to breathe, to slow down, to read carefully. The shares had been transferred to a holding entity, Kellerman Asset Trust, with distribution rights assigned to the company's founder and primary shareholders. But the trust had never been dissolved. The shares had never been distributed. They had simply sat here, in this sealed vault, accruing value while the world above forgot they existed. She found a ledger at the bottom of the case, a handwritten record of every transaction, every conversion, every share held by the trust. The final entry was dated October 1999, 2 years before the factory closed permanently. The accountant's note was brief. Holdings secured pending resolution of bankruptcy proceedings. Vault access restricted to authorized personnel only. The bankruptcy had dissolved the company, but it had not dissolved the trust. The shares still existed, and as far as she could tell from the documents, ownership of the factory property included ownership of everything contained within it, including this vault, including these certificates. Sarah sat down on the cold floor, the documents spread around her, and tried to process what she was looking at. If these shares were real, if they were still valid, their current value would be substantial. She pulled out her phone, which barely had signal in the basement, and began searching for the companies listed on the certificates. The first was a technology firm that had started as a small component manufacturer in the 1980s. It had since grown into a major player in the semiconductor industry, its stock trading at over $200 per share. According to the certificate in her hands, the Kellerman Trust held 50,000 shares. She did the math 3 times, certain she was making a mistake. 50,000 shares at $200 each. $10 million. From just one company. There were 8 companies listed in the trust's holdings. Her vision blurred. She set the phone down and pressed her palms against her eyes, trying to steady herself. This could not be real. This kind of thing did not happen. Not to people like her. Not to single mothers living in abandoned factories with eviction notices and overdue bills. But the certificates were real. The documents were real. The vault was real. And somewhere in the complex machinery of corporate law and property rights, these shares belonged to whoever owned this building, which, as of 4 weeks ago, was her. She gathered the documents carefully, placing them back in the case with trembling hands. She carried the case out of the vault and up the stairs, moving slowly, hardly daring to breathe. When she reached the main floor, she set it down and called Emma over. "Baby, I need you to stay right here with this box, okay? Don't open it. Don't let anyone near it. Can you do that for me?" Emma nodded, her eyes wide with concern. "Are you okay, Mom?" Sarah knelt down and hugged her daughter tightly. "I think we're going to be okay," she whispered. "I really think we're going to be okay." The next morning, Sarah drove to the city's financial district with the case of documents in her trunk. She had spent the night researching lawyers, looking for someone who specialized in corporate assets and property law. She found a firm that offered free initial consultations and made an appointment. The attorney, a woman named Margaret Chen, listened with professional skepticism as Sarah explained the situation. She described finding the vault, discovering the certificates, researching their potential value. Margaret's expression remained neutral throughout, but when Sarah spread the documents across her desk, something shifted, and Margaret examined each certificate carefully, cross-referencing lot numbers and serial codes, checking issue dates against corporate records she pulled up on her computer. The silence stretched for nearly 20 minutes. Finally, she looked up, her expression carefully controlled. "These appear to be legitimate," she said slowly. "But authenticating them will require verification from the issuing companies and potentially forensic analysis to confirm they haven't been reported lost or stolen. That process could take months." "But if they're real?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Margaret set down the certificate she was holding and met Sarah's eyes. "If they're real, and if your ownership of the property grants you legal claim to assets contained within it, and if these shares have not been otherwise claimed or legally disputed, then yes, you're looking at significant value. How significant? Margaret pulled up a financial website and began calculating, her fingers moving quickly across the keyboard. She wrote numbers on a legal pad, cross-referenced stock prices, factored in potential complications. When she was done, she turned the pad around so Sarah could see the final figure. $335 million. Sarah stared at the number, the room tilting around her. She thought of the eviction notice, of the $30 auction bid, of the week spent sleeping in a car and scraping together change for food. She thought of Emma, of the home visit she was terrified to allow, of the constant crushing weight of never having enough. "This can't be real," she said. "It might not be," Margaret cautioned. "There are a lot of legal hurdles to clear. Other parties could come forward with claims. The companies might dispute the validity of the certificates. The trust structure might have clauses we're not seeing yet. But as far as I can tell from these documents, you have a legitimate case for ownership." Sarah felt tears pressing against her eyes, but refused to let them fall. Not yet. Not until she knew for certain. "What do I do?" Margaret pulled out a contract. "You hire me to represent you through the verification and claims process. It will take time. It will be complex. But if this is real, it's worth fighting for." Sarah signed the papers with a hand that shook so badly she could barely form the letters of her name. Margaret agreed to work on contingency, not taking a percentage of any recovered assets, rather than charging upfront fees. It was the only way Sarah could afford representation at all. The verification process began immediately. Margaret filed claims with each of the companies, submitted the certificates for authentication, and began building the legal case for Sarah's ownership. The responses came slowly, filtered through layers of corporate bureaucracy and legal review. Some companies acknowledged receiving the certificates and agreed to investigate. Others responded with skepticism, questioning the chain of ownership and demanding extensive documentation. Sarah provided everything she had: property deeds, auction records, historical documents about the factory, photographs of the vault and its contents. She gave sworn statements, sat for depositions, and answered questions from lawyers who treated her with thinly veiled doubt. They looked at her worn clothes, her exhausted face, her calloused hands, and saw someone trying to scam them. She endured it all with a quiet determination that surprised even herself. She had lived with doubt and disbelief her entire adult life. This was just more of the same, but with higher stakes. Meanwhile, word began to spread. Someone at one of the companies leaked information about the claim, and within days, reporters started showing up at the factory. They knocked on the makeshift door she had installed, called out questions, offered money for interviews. Sarah refused them all. She kept Emma inside, away from cameras and curiosity, and waited for the legal process to run its course. The neighbors' reactions ranged from disbelief to anger. Some thought she was running a scam, that she had fabricated the whole story for attention or money. Others felt betrayed, as if her potential windfall was somehow taken from them. The woman from the corner store, who had mocked her for buying the factory, now refused to sell her groceries, claiming Sarah was putting on airs. But a few people reacted differently. An older man who lived 3 blocks away stopped by one evening with a casserole, the first hot meal Sarah and Emma had eaten in weeks. He told her he had worked at Kellerman Manufacturing in the 1980s, that he remembered when the vault was installed, though he had never known what was inside it. He said the company had been good to its workers, and if the money was real, it belonged to someone who would use it wisely. Sarah thanked him with tears in her eyes and invited him inside to share the meal. They sat on overturned crates in the factory's main floor, eating together, while Emma told stories about the adventures she had in the vast empty space. For the first time since arriving at the factory, Sarah felt like maybe, just maybe, she was not completely alone. The first company to verify their certificates was the technology firm. Their legal team confirmed that the shares were legitimate, that the Kellerman Asset Trust had never been dissolved, and that ownership of the trust's assets did appear to pass with ownership of the property. They acknowledged Sarah's claim and agreed to transfer the shares into her name pending final legal review. When Margaret called with the news, Sarah sat down on the factory floor and cried. Not delicate tears, but great racking sobs that came from somewhere so deep she had forgotten it existed. Emma ran over, frightened, asking what was wrong. Sarah pulled her daughter into her arms and held her while the weeks of terror and exhaustion poured out. "Nothing's wrong, baby," she managed to say. "Everything's right. Everything's finally right." The other companies followed over the next months, some quickly, others grudgingly. Each verification brought Sarah closer to a reality she still could not fully grasp. The lawyers warned her not to celebrate yet, that complications could still arise, that the process was far from over. But the momentum had shifted. The documents were real. The shares were real. The fortune hidden in the Kellerman factory vault was real, and it was hers. As winter deepened and the factory grew colder, Sarah began to make plans, real plans, not desperate gambles. She arranged for proper repairs to the building, hiring contractors to stabilize the structure, seal the roof, restore the utilities. She set aside funds for Emma's education, for medical care they had deferred, for all the things they had done without. But she did not abandon the factory. Even as wealth became reality, she felt connected to the building that had sheltered them when no one else would. She decided to restore it, to turn it into something meaningful. Maybe a community center, maybe affordable housing, maybe a museum honoring the workers who had given their lives to this place. The details could come later. For now, it was enough to know she had the power to choose. The home visit from Emma's teacher finally happened in late December. By then, Sarah had transformed one section of the factory into a proper living space. There were walls, heat, furniture, a real kitchen. The teacher walked through with wide eyes, taking in the vast space, the ongoing restoration, the evidence of transformation. "This is remarkable," she said, and Sarah heard genuine respect in her voice. Emma showed her favorite spots, the places she played, the projects she and her mother worked on together. She talked about the factory as if it were a castle, a magical place full of possibility. The teacher listened, smiled, and left with a report that noted the unconventional living situation, but acknowledged that Emma was thriving. That Christmas, Sarah bought Emma presents without checking her bank balance first. It was a small thing, ordinary for most people, but for Sarah, it felt like a miracle. She wrapped gifts in paper that was not salvaged from discarded boxes. She bought a tree and decorated it with new ornaments. She made a feast with ingredients she did not have to ration. Emma's joy was pure and uncomplicated, the happiness of a child who did not yet understand how close they had come to losing everything. Sarah watched her daughter open presents and felt something shift inside her chest. The weight of years, the crushing pressure of survival, began to lift. On New Year's Eve, as fireworks burst over the city, Sarah stood at one of the factory's high windows and looked out across the neighborhood. The building that everyone had dismissed as worthless, that she had bought for $30 in an act of desperation, had given her more than just wealth. It had given her dignity. It had proven that overlooked things could hold value that others were too blind or too busy to see. She thought about all the people who had laughed at her, who had called her crazy or desperate or foolish. She felt no anger toward them. They had seen what they expected to see, what the world had taught them to see. But she had learned to look deeper, to search beyond the surface, to believe that even broken things could hold treasures. The legal process would continue. There would be more paperwork, more verification, more complications to navigate. But the outcome was no longer in doubt. The fortune was real, and it was hers. In a few months, maybe a year, the final transfers would complete, and she would officially be a wealthy woman. But standing in the factory that night, watching the city celebrate the new year, Sarah understood that wealth was not just about money. It was about security, about choices, about the freedom to build instead of merely survive. It was about being able to look at her daughter's face and promise her a future without fear. She turned away from the window and walked back through the factory, running her hand along the brick walls that had sheltered them. Tomorrow she would continue the restoration work. Tomorrow she would make more plans, take more steps forward. But tonight, she allowed herself to simply be grateful. The Kellerman factory had been abandoned for 18 years before she found it. Everyone else had seen a ruin. She had seen a chance. And in that difference, in that willingness to look at what others dismissed, she had found not just wealth, but vindication. She had proven that sometimes the most valuable things are the ones everyone else walks past without noticing. As midnight approached and the final seconds of the year counted down, Sarah made a quiet promise to herself and to the building that had saved her. She would never forget what it felt like to have nothing. She would never forget the desperation that drove her to bid $30 on a property no one wanted. And she would never stop looking for treasure in the places others dismissed as worthless. Because she knew now, with absolute certainty, that miracles were not granted to those who waited for them. They were found by those who had the courage to search in the darkness, to open sealed doors, to believe that somewhere beneath the decay and abandonment, something valuable was waiting to be discovered. The fireworks burst brighter above the city. Emma called out from her room, asking if she could stay up to watch. Sarah called back that yes, tonight they could stay up as long as they wanted. They had earned it. They had survived. And now, finally, they could begin to live. The verification from the first company opened a floodgate that had been building pressure for months. Within 2 weeks of the technology firm's confirmation, 3 more companies completed their authentication processes. Each announcement arrived with formal letters, dense legal language that translated to the same fundamental truth. The certificates were legitimate, the shares were real, and Sarah Mitchell, against all probability, was the rightful owner. Margaret Chen called Sarah personally each time a new verification came through. Her voice, which had started professionally cautious, grew warmer with each conversation. By the 4th call, there was something close to awe in her tone. "I've been practicing law for 23 years, Margaret said. I've never seen anything like this. The precision of those documents, the way the trust was structured to survive bankruptcy, it's like someone planned for this exact scenario." Sarah sat in the factory's partially renovated office space, a room that now had actual walls and a working heater, and listened as Margaret outlined the growing sum. Each verified block of shares added millions to the total. The numbers had ceased to feel real somewhere around the 50 million mark. Now, as they climbed past 200 million, Sarah experienced them as abstractions, symbols on a page, rather than money she could actually touch. But the reactions of others were very real. The news had spread beyond legal offices and corporate boardrooms into the wider world. A financial blogger picked up the story, and it went viral within hours. Single mother discovers $300 million plus fortune in abandoned factory. She bought for $30, read the headline, and suddenly Sarah's phone would not stop ringing. Reporters camped outside the factory gates. Television vans lined the street. Helicopters buzzed overhead. Cameras pointed down at the property she had bought in desperation. The attention was overwhelming, invasive, and utterly relentless. Sarah stopped answering her phone except for Margaret's calls. She kept Emma home from school for a week, afraid of what the media circus would do to her daughter's sense of normalcy. The neighbors who had mocked her, who had laughed at her foolishness, now found themselves confronted with an impossible reality. Sarah saw it in their faces when she ventured out for groceries. The woman from the corner store who had refused to serve her now greeted her with strained politeness, her eyes unable to meet Sarah's directly. The man who had called the factory a death trap drove past slowly, staring with an expression caught between disbelief and something darker. Some approached her directly. A woman who lived 2 streets over knocked on the factory door one afternoon, her face flushed with embarrassment. "I said some things," she began, her voice unsteady, "about you being crazy for buying this place. I just wanted to say I was wrong." Sarah invited her in for coffee, which they drank sitting on mismatched chairs in what was becoming a proper living room. The woman's name was Patricia, and she had 3 children of her own, a husband who worked construction, and a mortgage that kept them perpetually on edge. She understood survival, understood desperation, but she had not understood Sarah's gamble until it paid off. "How did you know?" Patricia asked, her hands wrapped around the warm mug. "How did you know there was something here worth finding?" Sarah thought about the question for a long moment before answering. "I didn't," she said finally. "I had no idea what was in that vault. I bought this place because it was all I could afford, and even that was stupid. I just kept looking because giving up felt worse than failing." Patricia nodded slowly, processing this. "What are you going to do now?" she asked. "With all that money?" It was the question everyone wanted to know, and the one journalists shouted from behind the fence, the one that appeared in every article and social media post. Sarah had thought about it constantly since the first verification came through. She had made lists, crossed them out, started over. The possibilities were endless and paralyzing. "I'm going to make sure my daughter never knows what it's like to be hungry," Sarah said. "Beyond that, I'm still figuring it out." But she was figuring it out, piece by piece. The restoration of the factory continued, but on a scale she had never imagined possible. She hired architects who specialized in historic preservation, engineers who could stabilize the structure without destroying its character. The collapsed sections of roof were rebuilt. The broken windows were replaced with period-appropriate glass. The graffiti-stained walls were carefully cleaned, revealing the original brick beneath. She kept the basement vault exactly as she had found it, transforming it into a climate-controlled archive. The metal cases that had held the stock certificates now held something else. The story of her discovery, documented and preserved for anyone who wanted to understand how an impossible thing had happened. She had photographs mounted on the walls, showing the factory in its abandoned state, the sealed door, the moment she first opened those cases. It became a testament to the value of looking beyond the surface, of believing that overlooked things could matter. As the legal process ground toward its conclusion, more companies completed their verifications. By early spring, 7 of the 8 had confirmed the authenticity of their certificates and agreed to transfer the shares. The 8th, a pharmaceutical company that had grown from a small research lab into a major corporation, initially resisted. Their legal team argued that the chain of ownership was unclear, that Sarah's claim jumped too many steps to be valid. Margaret fought back with meticulous documentation, building a case that connected every link in the chain from the original trust to Sarah's auction purchase. The process took 3 months and required testimony from county officials, archivists, and even the auctioneer who had overseen the sale. Finally, faced with overwhelming evidence and the precedent set by the other 7 companies, the pharmaceutical firm relented. They verified their portion of the certificates and transferred the shares. The final total, accounting for stock splits, dividends, and market fluctuations, came to $337 million, $422,000. Margaret delivered the news on a Tuesday afternoon, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was saying. "It's done," she said. "All transfers are complete. The shares are officially in your name. You can liquidate them, hold them, do whatever you want. The money is yours." Sarah sat in the factory's renovated office, Emma coloring at a small table nearby, and felt something break open inside her. Not tears, though those would come later. Something deeper. The armor she had built around herself, the hardness required to survive years of barely making it, cracked and fell away. She was safe. Emma was safe. They would never go hungry again. They would never face eviction again. They would never be one emergency away from homelessness. The first thing she did with the money was buy the factory outright, paying off the property taxes and securing the deed in a way that no future auction or bureaucratic error could challenge. Then she set up trust funds for Emma, structured to provide for her education, her future, her dreams, whatever they might be. She paid off every debt she had ever accumulated, every medical bill, every credit card, every loan. She watched the balances drop to zero with a satisfaction that was almost spiritual. But the money that mattered most to her came from a different place. She donated $10 million to organizations that helped families facing eviction, and that provided emergency housing, that fought to keep mothers and children together when the world tried to tear them apart. She had been those mothers. She understood their fear in a way that no amount of research or empathy could replicate. If she could spare even one family the terror she had lived through, the money would be worth it. The transformation extended beyond finances. Sarah's confidence, which had been ground down by years of rejection and failure, began to rebuild. She spoke at community meetings about affordable housing, about the invisible families living one paycheck from disaster. She testified before City Council about zoning laws that made it nearly impossible for low-income residents to find stable homes. Her story gave her a platform, and she used it to amplify voices that typically went unheard. And the factory itself became a symbol of possibility. Sarah completed its restoration in the summer, transforming it into a mixed-use space that honored its history while serving the community's needs. The main floor became a community center, offering free programs for children, job training for adults, and meeting space for local organizations. The upper floors were converted into affordable apartments, rented at rates that families could actually afford without sacrificing food or medicine. She hired staff from the neighborhood, people who had been jobless or underemployed, giving them stable work with decent pay and benefits. One of her first hires was Ray, the locksmith who had examined the vault door. He became the building's maintenance supervisor, though his knowledge of old industrial systems invaluable in keeping the complex machinery running. The older man who had brought her a casserole during her darkest days became a regular presence at the community center. His name was Frank, and he had stories about working at Kellerman Manufacturing that captivated everyone who heard them. Sarah asked him to lead an oral history project, recording the memories of former workers and documenting the factory's role in the community's past. The recordings became part of the archive she was building, preserving a history that might otherwise have been lost. Not everyone celebrated her success. Some people remained bitter, convinced that Sarah's fortune was unearned luck rather than the result of perseverance and risk. Anonymous letters arrived accusing her of greed, of forgetting where she came from, of using her wealth to buy attention and respect. She read them all, filed them away, and continued her work. She understood that their anger had less to do with her and more to do with their own struggles, their own feelings of being left behind by a world that seemed to reward only the lucky or the already privileged. Emma thrived in ways Sarah had only dreamed possible. She enrolled in a good school, one with art programs and science labs, and teachers who had time to nurture curious minds. She made friends easily, children who came to the factory after school and played in the community center, while their parents attended classes or job interviews. She grew confident, creative, secure in the knowledge that her mother's love was no longer divided between caring for her and fighting for survival. One afternoon, almost a year after the discovery, Sarah sat with Emma in the factory's library, a bright space filled with donated books and comfortable chairs. Emma was reading about marine biology, her current obsession, completely absorbed in descriptions of deep-sea creatures that lived in darkness. "Mom," Emma asked, without looking up from her book, "do you remember when we lived in the car?" Sarah's chest tightened. "I do, baby." "Why?" "I used to pretend we were on an adventure," Emma said, "like explorers camping out. I didn't want you to be sad." Sarah set down the book she was holding and pulled her daughter close. "You were very brave," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You were braver," Emma replied. "You're the one who found the treasure." Sarah thought about that statement. About the word treasure and what it really meant. The stock certificates had value measured in hundreds of millions of dollars. But the real treasure was sitting beside her, reading about octopuses and asking questions about bioluminescence. The real treasure was the security to dream, to plan, to believe that the future held possibility instead of just more struggle. The media attention eventually faded, replaced by newer stories, fresher miracles. Sarah was grateful for the return to relative privacy, though the factory remained a destination for people seeking inspiration or hope. Visitors came from across the country, wanting to see the place where an impossible discovery had occurred. Sarah welcomed them, gave tours of the archive, showed them the vault door, and explained how she had found the override mechanism. And she told them the truth, that she had not known what she would find, that desperation rather than wisdom had driven her decisions, that luck played as much of a role as determination. But she also told them that luck favored those who kept searching, who refused to accept that overlooked things had no value, who believed that buried treasure existed not just in stories, but in the real world, waiting for someone brave enough or desperate enough to dig. One visitor stood out from the rest, a woman in her 50s, well-dressed, but with eyes that carried the weight of too many battles. She introduced herself as Linda Kellerman, granddaughter of the factory's founder. She had driven 6 hours to see the building, to stand in the space where her grandfather had built something that mattered. Sarah gave her a private tour, and showing her the restored machinery, the photographs of workers from the factory's heyday, the carefully preserved documents that told the story of Kellerman Manufacturing. Linda walked through in silence, occasionally reaching out to touch a wall or a piece of equipment, connecting with memories she had only heard about secondhand. When they reached the vault, Linda stopped and stared at the open steel door. "I didn't know this existed," she said quietly. "My father never mentioned it. When the company went under, he just walked away. Said there was nothing left worth saving." Sarah showed her the documents, explaining how the trust had been structured, how the shares had been converted and preserved. Linda examined the certificates with hands that trembled slightly. "He would have been so ashamed," she said, "to know that he gave up when this was sitting here all along." "Maybe he didn't know," Sarah offered gently. Linda shook her head. "He knew there was money somewhere. He just didn't want to fight for it. Easier to declare bankruptcy and move on than to dig through the rubble." She looked at Sarah with an expression of profound respect. "You didn't give up. You kept looking when everyone else would have walked away. That's why you found it." They sat together in the archive for over an hour, Linda sharing stories about her grandfather's vision for the factory, the pride he took in employing good people and producing quality work. She talked about how the company's decline had broken him, how he had died, believing he had failed everyone who depended on him. Sarah listened, understanding that this visit was about more than nostalgia. It was about closure, about learning that something of value had survived the collapse. Before Linda left, she made a request. She wanted to donate her own family's records to the archive, documents and photographs that would complete the historical picture Sarah was building. Sarah agreed immediately, and within weeks, boxes of materials arrived, filling in gaps in the factory's story and connecting past to present in ways that honored both. The second year brought new challenges. Sarah discovered that wealth, while solving many problems, created others. People emerged claiming connections to the factory or the Kellerman family, arguing that they deserved a share of the fortune. Legal challenges were filed and had to be defended against. Investment advisors offered strategies for growing the money, some legitimate, many predatory. Sarah learned to navigate this new landscape with the same caution she had once applied to stretching a grocery budget. She assembled a team of advisors she trusted, people who understood that her wealth was not just about accumulation, but about impact. She created a foundation focused on housing security, education access, and economic opportunity for families trapped in the cycle of poverty she had known too well. The foundation's first project was purchasing abandoned properties across the city, buildings that others had dismissed as worthless, and transforming them into affordable housing. Each building was approached with the same philosophy that had guided the factory's restoration: preserve what was valuable, repair what was broken, and create spaces where people could build lives with dignity. Some projects succeeded spectacularly, others failed, revealing damage too severe to overcome economically. But even the failures taught lessons that informed future efforts, creating a knowledge base that other communities could learn from. Emma grew into adolescence with a groundedness that surprised everyone who met her. Despite the wealth surrounding her, she understood struggle because she had lived it during the years that mattered most. She volunteered at the community center, tutoring younger children, helping with programs, treating people with respect regardless of their circumstances. She spoke openly about the months she had spent sleeping in the factory, about the fear and uncertainty, about watching her mother fight for survival. "I don't ever want to forget," she told Sarah one evening, "because if I forget, I might stop caring about people who are still there." Sarah hugged her daughter, overwhelmed with pride and love. This, more than any financial success, was the true measure of what they had built together. As the second anniversary of the discovery approached, Sarah stood in the factory's main floor during a community gathering. Hundreds of people filled the space: neighbors and friends, families who used the center's programs, workers who had found employment through her initiatives. Someone had organized a celebration, bringing food and music, transforming the industrial space into something warm and alive. Frank took the microphone and asked for everyone's attention. 2 years ago, he said, his voice carrying across the room, most of us thought this building was finished. We drove past it every day and saw nothing but decay. Sarah Mitchell saw something different. She saw possibility. And because she refused to accept that broken things were worthless, she changed all of our lives. The room erupted in applause. Sarah felt her face flush, uncomfortable with the praise, but moved by the genuine affection in their faces. Emma stood beside her, holding her hand, anchoring her to the moment. "I want to tell you something," Frank continued when the applause quieted. "I worked in this building for 18 years. I was here the day they installed that vault. We all wondered what was so important that it needed that kind of security. Management told us it was just sensitive documents, company records. We believed them because we didn't have any reason not to." He paused, looking around at the gathered faces. "Well, but I think the real treasure was never the stock certificates. The real treasure was the possibility that this building represented, that something we thought was dead could come back to life, That investment in people and community could matter more than profit margins. Sarah found money in that vault, sure, but what she did with it, that's the real discovery. More applause, louder this time. Sarah felt tears streaming down her face, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming recognition that she had somehow managed to do something that mattered. Not just for herself and Emma, but for people she had never met, people whose lives intersected with hers in this restored building that had once been a monument to abandonment. Later that evening, after the guests had left, and Emma was asleep in their apartment upstairs, Sarah walked through the quiet factory alone. She traced the same path she had taken on that first desperate day, when the building was dark and dangerous, and she had no idea what she was stepping into. She paused at the basement door and descended the stairs, her footsteps echoing in the familiar way. The vault stood open, its steel door propped back, the interior now a museum of her journey. She stepped inside and sat on the floor where she had first opened those cases, where the world had changed with the crack of a seal and the rustle of old papers. She thought about that moment, about the disbelief and fear and desperate hope that had coursed through her. "Thank you," she whispered to the empty room, to the building, to whatever force or chance or determination had led her here. "Thank you for not giving up on me." She sat in the silence for a long time, letting memories wash over her. The eviction notice, the auction listing, the $30 bid that had seemed so reckless, the months of sleeping in cars and scraping for food, the mockery of neighbors who saw only foolishness in her desperate gamble, the moment she found the hidden door, the grinding resistance of the crank, the first glimpse of what lay inside. Every step had felt impossible at the time. Every decision had been made with incomplete information and insufficient resources. She had been terrified, exhausted, certain she was making mistakes that would destroy what little she had left. But she had kept moving forward because stopping meant accepting a future she could not bear. The journey had not made her bitter or hard. It had made her certain that miracles were not cosmic accidents granted to the deserving. They were opportunities disguised as impossibilities, buried in places no one thought to look, waiting for someone desperate or brave enough to keep searching when logic said to stop. Sarah stood and walked back through the factory, turning off lights as she went, securing doors, checking the systems that kept the building safe and warm. She climbed the stairs to her apartment, where Emma slept peacefully, secure in a way that still made Sarah's heart ache with gratitude. She had bought a condemned factory for $30 because she had no other options. She had found $337 million because she refused to accept that broken things could not hold value. But the real fortune, the one that money could not measure, was the knowledge that she had survived, that she had protected her daughter, that she had transformed desperation into determination and found treasure in the last place anyone thought to look. In the years that followed, the Kellerman factory became more than just a building. It became a symbol, a story told in business schools and inspirational speeches, a reminder that overlooked things could hold extraordinary value. Researchers studied the trust structure that had preserved the shares, marveling at its resilience. Historians documented the factory's role in the community's economic history. Urban planners pointed to it as a model for adaptive reuse of industrial spaces. But for Sarah, it remained simply home, the place where she had gambled everything on a dollar and found more than money. The place where Emma had learned that treasures existed beyond fairy tales. The place where a community had rediscovered its own worth by watching a desperate woman refuse to give up. She never forgot what it felt like to have nothing. She kept the eviction notice framed on her office wall, a reminder of how close she had come to losing everything. She maintained connections with organizations serving families in crisis, showing up personally to volunteer, to listen, to remind people that survival was possible even when it felt impossible. And every year, on the anniversary of the day she opened the vault, she led tours of the factory for people facing their own impossible situations. She showed them the hidden door, explained how she found the override, demonstrated the mechanism that had changed her life. She told them that they wouldn't find stock certificates in their basements, that her story was extraordinary in its specifics. But the principle, she insisted, was universal. The world was full of overlooked treasures, opportunities dismissed because they appeared broken or worthless or too difficult. The people who succeeded were not always the smartest or the most prepared. They were the ones who kept looking when others walked away, who believed that buried value existed, who refused to accept that desperation meant defeat. "I bought a condemned factory for $30, she told them. Everyone thought I was crazy. They were probably right. But I kept searching anyway, and I found something no one else knew was there. Your treasure might not be money. It might be an idea, a skill, a connection, a piece of knowledge that others have overlooked. But it's there, waiting for you to find it. You just have to keep looking." Some people left inspired. Others left skeptical. But a few, the ones carrying that particular weight of desperation and stubborn hope, left with something more. They left believing that impossible things could happen if you refused to stop searching. And sometimes, just sometimes, that belief was enough to help them find their own hidden treasures. Sarah Mitchell had discovered $337 million in an abandoned factory. But the real discovery was simpler and more profound, that the line between worthless and priceless was often just a matter of perspective, and that the greatest treasures in life were usually found in the places everyone else had decided were not worth exploring. She stood at the factory's window on a quiet evening, watching the sun set over the city, Emma's laughter drifting up from the community center below. The building that everyone had dismissed, that she had bought in desperation for the price of a takeout meal, had become the foundation for a life she never imagined possible. The treasure had been real, but the true miracle was that she had been brave enough, or desperate enough, or stubborn enough to believe it might be there. And in the end, that belief had made all the difference. 10 years later, the Kellerman factory stood as a landmark in the city, its restored facade gleaming, its programs serving thousands of families, its archive preserving a history that might otherwise have been lost. Sarah walked its halls with Emma, now a young woman studying social work, planning her own projects to help communities in crisis. They talked about expanding the foundation's work, about purchasing more abandoned properties, about creating networks of support for families facing eviction. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't bid on this place?" Emma asked. Sarah considered the question. She thought about the eviction notice, about the $300 in her checking account, about the desperation that had driven her to an auction listing at midnight in a library. She thought about all the versions of her life that could have existed, all the paths she might have taken. "I think we would have survived," she said finally. "We always found a way. But I'm glad we didn't have to find out." They stood together in the vault, looking at the preserved archive, at the photographs documenting a journey from desperation to security. Sarah had never hidden the struggle. She had documented it, preserved it, made it part of the story, because she knew that sanitizing the past would dishonor everyone still living through their own versions of it. "The money changed our lives," Sarah said, "but it didn't save us. We saved ourselves by refusing to give up. The money just gave us options we didn't have before." Emma nodded, understanding in a way that only someone who had lived through it could. They walked back up the stairs together, turning off lights, securing the building, preparing it for another day of serving the community that had become their family. Sarah paused at the main entrance, looking back at the vast space that had sheltered them, challenged them, and ultimately rewarded them beyond any reasonable expectation. She thought about the woman she had been, desperate and exhausted, making a $30 bid because she had nothing left to lose. She wanted to tell that woman that everything would be okay, that the gamble would pay off, that the treasure was real. But she also knew that woman would not have believed her. That woman had survived by not counting on miracles, by planning for the worst while hoping for the best. That woman's skepticism had been her armor, her protection against the cruelty of disappointed hope. So instead, Sarah simply felt grateful. Grateful for the desperation that drove her to keep searching. Grateful for the overlooked factory that no one else wanted. Grateful for the hidden vault that preserved a fortune through decades of abandonment. Grateful for the daughter who had endured their hardest years with resilience and love. Grateful for the community that had learned to see value in broken things. She locked the door and walked home through streets that had once felt dangerous and unpredictable, but now felt like family. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new families in crisis, new opportunities to make a difference. But tonight, she would rest in the knowledge that she had done something that mattered. She had found treasure in an abandoned factory. She had transformed desperation into hope. She had proven that overlooked things could hold extraordinary value. And she had built a life that honored both the struggle and the miracle, never forgetting where she came from, always remembering what it felt like to have nothing. The Kellerman factory stood behind her in the darkness, its windows glowing with warm light, its walls solid and secure, its story forever intertwined with hers. A monument not to luck, but to the stubborn belief that somewhere beneath the decay and abandonment, something valuable was waiting to be found. And that belief, more than any amount of money, was the real treasure she had discovered. The months between the initial discovery and the final verification were filled with moments that Sarah would remember for the rest of her life. Small incidents that didn't make the news, but shaped her understanding of what the fortune truly meant. There was the morning she woke to find someone had spray-painted fraud across the factory's exterior wall in letters 3 feet tall. She stood in the cold dawn light, staring at the accusation, and felt something harden inside her. Instead of cleaning it immediately, she left it there for a week, a reminder that judgment came easily to those who had never faced her choices. The graffiti attracted more attention than she expected. People stopped to photograph it, to argue about whether she deserved the money or had somehow cheated the system. A local art student asked permission to create a mural around it, transforming the accusation into part of a larger piece about perception and value. Sarah agreed, and within days, the word fraud was surrounded by images of abandoned buildings revealing hidden beauty, of overlooked objects transformed into treasures. The mural became one of the factory's most photographed features, a statement about how quickly opinions could shift when circumstances changed. During this period, Sarah received a visit from a man who introduced himself as Detective Marcus Holloway. He worked in the Financial Crimes Division and had been assigned to investigate whether the stock certificates had been obtained through illegal means. Sarah's stomach dropped when he showed his badge, but she invited him in and answered every question with the same careful honesty she had shown the lawyers. Detective Holloway was in his 50s, with gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. He spent 3 days at the factory, examining the vault, reviewing her documentation, interviewing neighbors about her character and circumstances. He looked through her financial records going back years, tracing every dollar she had earned and spent. The scrutiny was invasive and humiliating, but Sarah endured it because she had nothing to hide. On the final day, Detective Holloway sat with her in the factory's makeshift office and closed his notepad. "I've investigated a lot of financial crimes," he said. "Fraud, embezzlement, money laundering. People go to great lengths to hide their tracks, to create false narratives that make stolen money look legitimate. You know what I found when I looked into your story? Sarah waited, her heart pounding. Absolutely nothing, he said. No hidden bank accounts, no suspicious transactions, no connections to anyone who might have known about those certificates. You're exactly what you appear to be, a woman who made a desperate gamble and got lucky. He paused, his expression softening slightly. The department received anonymous complaints saying you must have known what was in that vault, that the whole story was fabricated. I had to follow up, but I'm closing this investigation. You're clean. After he left, Sarah sat alone for a long time, processing the realization that even as her fortune grew, people were actively working to discredit her, to find proof that she did not deserve what she had found. The bitterness of that knowledge sat heavy in her chest, but she refused to let it poison her. She had survived worse than suspicion. There were lighter moments, too, unexpected joys that emerged from the chaos. A documentary filmmaker named Angela Torres reached out, asking to tell Sarah's story not as a feel-good miracle, but as an honest examination of poverty, desperation, and the lottery-like nature of economic mobility in America. Unlike the tabloid reporters, Angela wanted to understand the system that had pushed Sarah to such extremes, and not just celebrate her escape from it. Sarah agreed to participate, and over 6 months, Angela and her crew captured footage that went far beyond the factory. They interviewed Emma, who spoke with startling clarity about what it felt like to pretend everything was an adventure when she knew her mother was scared. They talked to former landlords, employers who had let Sarah go, teachers who had noticed Emma's worn clothes but said nothing. They documented the lives of families still living in the circumstances Sarah had escaped, showing that her story was exceptional precisely because it was so rare. When the documentary premiered at a film festival, it won awards and sparked national conversations about housing insecurity and wealth inequality. Sarah attended the screening and watched her life play out on a giant screen. Seeing herself in footage she had forgotten was captured. There was a scene of her scrubbing the factory floor in those early days, her face drawn with exhaustion, Emma sleeping in the car visible through a window. She had not known Angela was filming that moment. Seeing it now, from the outside, she barely recognized the woman she had been. The attention from the documentary brought both opportunities and complications. A major publisher offered her a book deal, wanting her to write a memoir about the experience. Sarah initially declined, uncomfortable with the idea of profiting further from her story. But Margaret convinced her that the book could serve a purpose beyond money. It could provide detailed information about resources for families in crisis, about legal rights, about the systems that both failed and occasionally saved people like her. Sarah spent 6 months writing, often late at night after Emma was asleep, pouring out memories she had tried to forget. The process was painful, forcing her to relive moments of humiliation and fear she had buried beneath the celebration of her success. She wrote about the night she had seriously considered giving Emma to her mother to raise, believing her daughter would be better off without her. She wrote about stealing food from a grocery store, justifying it because Emma needed to eat and there was no other way. She wrote about the shame that had consumed her, the certainty that she was failing at the most basic requirements of parenthood. The book, titled The $30 Gamble, became a bestseller not because of the fortune she found, but because of the honesty with which she described poverty. Readers responded to her refusal to sanitize the experience, to make it inspiring rather than desperate. She received thousands of letters from people living in their cars, sleeping in shelters, working 3 jobs and still falling behind. They thanked her for telling the truth, for acknowledging that survival required compromises that left scars. With the book's success came speaking invitations, and Sarah found herself on stages she never imagined occupying. She spoke at universities, corporate conferences, and community centers, always bringing the conversation back to the systems that created desperation rather than the individual triumph that let her escape it. She made people uncomfortable by refusing to let them celebrate her story without acknowledging the millions of others who worked just as hard and never found hidden vaults. One speech in particular stayed with her. It was at a wealthy suburbs community center where she had been invited to inspire local residents to donate to charity. The audience was polite but distant, treating her story as entertainment rather than education. During the question period, a woman in expensive jewelry asked, "What advice would you give to people who are struggling? How can they find their own treasure?" Sarah looked at the woman for a long moment before answering. "The honest answer is that most people won't find treasure," she said. "They'll work hard their entire lives and never get lucky. They'll make good decisions and still end up in crisis because the margin for error is non-existent when you're poor. My advice isn't to keep searching for hidden vaults. It's to build a society where people don't need to find $300 million to avoid homelessness." The room went silent. Some people nodded. Others looked offended. But Sarah did not soften her words. She had learned that her platform came with responsibility, and that responsibility included telling truths that comfortable people did not want to hear. Back at the factory, life developed rhythms that felt almost normal. Emma made friends with children from the neighborhood, kids who came to the community center after school and treated the building like a second home. Sarah watched them play in spaces she had restored and felt a satisfaction deeper than any financial success. These children would grow up with access to programs and opportunities their parents never had. That mattered more than any stock certificate. But there were also painful reminders of the distance money created. One afternoon, a woman Sarah had known from her days at the grocery store came to the factory seeking help. Her name was Diane, and she was facing eviction from the same apartment building where Sarah had once lived. She had heard about Sarah's foundation and hoped for assistance, maybe help with the deposit on a new place. Sarah invited her in and listened to her story, hearing echoes of her own past in every detail. Diane worked 2 jobs, had a daughter in middle school, and was 3 months behind on rent due to medical bills from a broken arm. The mathematics of survival were identical to what Sarah had faced, the same impossible equation with no good solutions. Sarah wrote her a check for $10,000, enough to cover the back rent and several months forward, enough to provide breathing room. Diane stared at the check, then at Sarah, her eyes filling with tears. "I don't know what to say," she managed. "Don't say anything," Sarah replied. "Just take care of your daughter." After Diane left, Sarah sat alone and cried. Not from sadness, but from the overwhelming awareness of how arbitrary her rescue had been. Diane was no less deserving, no less hard-working, no less desperate than Sarah had been. The only difference was that Sarah had happened to buy a building with a hidden vault. And Diane would go home with temporary relief, but the underlying precariousness of her life remained unchanged. The unfairness of it threatened to crush Sarah under its weight. Margaret called one evening with news about a complication Sarah had not anticipated. A man claiming to be a distant relative of the Kellerman family had filed a lawsuit, arguing that the trust's assets should revert to family members rather than transfer with the property. His claim was legally weak, Margaret assured her, but it would require additional hearings and documentation to dismiss. The lawsuit dragged on for 8 months, consuming time and energy Sarah wanted to spend on other things. She sat through depositions where the man's lawyers asked invasive questions about her background, her relationship with Emma's father, and her financial history before the discovery. They tried to paint her as an opportunist who had somehow manipulated the system, despite all evidence to the contrary. The man himself, Robert Kellerman, never spoke to her directly. She saw him only in courtrooms, a bitter-faced man in his 60s who seemed to believe the fortune was stolen from him personally. When the judge finally dismissed his case, ruling that the chain of ownership was clear and legal, Robert left without a word. Sarah felt no triumph in the victory, only exhaustion. Around this same time, Emma started having nightmares. She would wake crying, unable to articulate what frightened her, clinging to Sarah with a desperation that echoed their hardest days. Sarah took her to a therapist who specialized in childhood trauma, and over weeks of gentle conversation, the truth emerged. Emma was terrified that the money would disappear, that they would wake up back in the car, that the factory would be taken away. "I know it doesn't make sense," Emma said during one session, Sarah holding her hand. "But I keep thinking it's too good to be real. Like we're going to wake up, and it will all be gone." The therapist helped Emma understand that her fears were a normal response to the instability she had experienced, that feeling secure would take time. But hearing her daughter articulate those terrors broke something in Sarah's heart. She had thought escaping poverty would heal the damage it caused, but she learned that trauma lived in the body long after circumstances changed. Emma would carry scars from their desperate years, just as Sarah would, and no amount of money could erase them entirely. To help Emma process her fears, Sarah created a ritual. Every evening, they walked through the factory together, Sarah pointing out the solid walls, the secure locks, the evidence of permanence. "This is real," she would say. "We're safe. This is ours." Gradually, over months, the nightmares became less frequent, and Emma began to trust in their stability. The factory's community center became known throughout the city, attracting volunteers who wanted to be part of something meaningful. One volunteer, a retired teacher named Helen, started a literacy program that served both children and adults. Another, a carpenter named James, who had lost his job during the recession, taught woodworking skills that led several participants to paying work. The building buzzed with activity, proving that spaces dismissed as worthless could become centers of transformation. Sarah hired a woman named Keisha to manage the center's operations. Keisha had been living in a shelter when they met, attending a job fair the foundation sponsored. She had degrees in social work and nonprofit management, but had been unable to find work after a felony conviction from a decade earlier. Sarah looked at her resume, looked at her eyes that carried the weight of a system that made redemption nearly impossible, and offered her the job on the spot. Keisha became one of Sarah's closest friends, someone who understood both struggle and the complex emotions that came with escape. They talked late into the night sometimes, sharing stories, processing the guilt that came with having resources when others still suffered. Keisha helped Sarah understand that her discomfort with wealth was valid, but that it could also become paralyzing if she let it. "You can't save everyone," Keisha said during one of these conversations, "and you can't feel guilty for surviving. What you can do is use what you have to change as many lives as possible. That's enough. It has to be enough." The factory's archive grew as more people contributed materials. Former workers donated photographs, time cards, union newsletters, personal stories that painted a picture of industrial life in the 20th century. Historians from the state university became involved, seeing the archive as a valuable resource for understanding labor history and economic transformation. What had started as Sarah's personal documentation became something larger, for a community memory preserved for future generations. On Emma's 14th birthday, Sarah threw a party at the factory that drew over 100 people. Children ran through the spaces where Sarah had once slept in a car, their laughter echoing off walls that had witnessed her darkest moments. She watched Emma blow out candles surrounded by friends, teachers, neighbors, all people who had become family in the years since the discovery. The contrast between this celebration and the desperate birthdays of the past struck her with physical force. Later that night, after the guests had left and Emma was asleep, Sarah returned to the vault alone. She did this occasionally when she needed to remember, to ground herself in the reality of what had happened. She sat on the floor where she had first opened those cases and let herself feel the full weight of the journey. Sometimes the fortune still did not feel real. Sometimes she expected to wake up in that cramped apartment with an eviction notice under the door, the factory, and everything that came from it, nothing but an elaborate dream. But the cold floor beneath her was solid. The documents in the archive were tangible, and the lives changed by her foundation were undeniably real. The miracle had happened. She had lived through it. And now she carried the responsibility of making it mean something beyond her own salvation. The media occasionally revisited her story, especially around anniversaries of the discovery. Reporters would call asking for updates, wanting to know if she had any regrets or lessons learned. Sarah gave fewer interviews as time passed, uncomfortable with the mythologizing of her experience. She was not a hero. She was a desperate woman who got impossibly lucky. The difference mattered to her, even if it made for less inspiring headlines. One journalist, more thoughtful than most, asked her what she wished people understood about her story. Sarah thought for a long time before answering. "I wish they understood that poverty isn't a failure of character or effort," she said finally. "I worked as hard when I had nothing as I do now with everything. The difference wasn't me, it was circumstances. And most people in my situation won't find hidden treasure. They'll just keep struggling. That's the part of the story that matters, not the miracle ending." The article that resulted from that interview was shared widely, sparking conversations about systemic inequality and the mythology of individual success. Some people called Sarah ungrateful for not simply celebrating her good fortune. Others thanked her for refusing to let her story become just another bootstrap narrative that blamed poverty on the poor. As the 10th anniversary of the discovery approached, Sarah decided to do something she had been considering for years. She established a fund specifically for people facing eviction in the city, offering zero-interest loans or outright grants to cover back rent and deposits. The fund was named after the apartment building where she had received her eviction notice, a way of honoring the fear that had driven her to the factory in the first place. The fund helped hundreds of families in its first year, preventing evictions that would have cascaded into job loss, school disruption, and deepening crisis. Each family assisted received a letter from Sarah explaining that she understood their situation, that she had stood where they were standing, and that this help came with no judgment and no strings attached. Many wrote back with gratitude that moved her to tears. Some shared their own stories, creating a growing archive of experiences that documented the reality of housing insecurity in America. Emma, now thriving in high school, started bringing friends to volunteer at the factory. They organized donation drives, tutored younger children, and helped with maintenance projects. Sarah watched her daughter teach others to look beyond surface appearances, to see value in overlooked places and people. Emma had absorbed the lessons of their journey without the bitterness that might have twisted them, transforming trauma into empathy. On the actual anniversary date, Sarah stood in the basement at the vault door with just Emma beside her. No reporters, no celebrations, just the two of them marking the moment that had changed everything. Sarah placed her hand on the steel door, feeling its cold solidity, and thought about the person she had been 10 years ago. The desperate woman cranking that manual release with bleeding hands and no real hope. "I want to tell you something I've never said out loud," Sarah said to Emma. "When I found this door, I didn't think there was treasure behind it. I thought maybe it was a way out, An exit I could use if things got so bad I couldn't go on. I was that close to giving up. Emma's eyes widened with understanding and pain. She took her mother's hand. "But I opened it anyway," Sarah continued. "And instead of an exit, I found a future. That's what I think about when I stand here. Not the money, but the fact that I chose to keep going even when I wanted to stop. That's the real treasure, the one that mattered before we found the certificates." They stood together in silence, honoring the journey that had brought them from desperation to security, from isolation to community, from survival to purpose. The vault no longer held stock certificates, but it still contained the most valuable thing Sarah had ever found: proof that overlooked places could hold miracles, and that the difference between tragedy and triumph sometimes came down to a $30 bid and the stubborn refusal to give up. As they walked back up the stairs together, Sarah felt a profound gratitude not for the wealth, but for the journey that had taught her to recognize value in unexpected places. She had learned to see what others missed, and that skill, more than any fortune, was the gift she would carry forward for the rest of her life. The Kellerman factory had been dismissed as worthless by everyone except one desperate woman who had nothing left to lose. In that dismissal lay the space where miracles became possible, where overlooked treasures waited for someone brave enough to look. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.